Okay, with me today is Andre Pienaar, the CEO and founder of C5 Capital. Well, Andre, this is for South Africans in particular a very interesting week with President Cyril Ramaphosa, being in Washington, going to the Trump administration. So what is your view on that?
Linda, thank you. Well, first, I think we have to start with the arrival of the Afrikaner families in the U.S. Last week, on which President Ramaphosa has made quite a lot of comment. My wife and I would very much want to welcome these families in the U.S. because almost without exception they have been victims of very serious and violent crime in South Africa. And as someone who had the responsibility to combat organized crime and terrorism in South Africa when I founded the Scorpions for President Mandela, I know how traumatic these violent crime incidents are on families across the country. And so I have tremendous compassion for these families who have packed up everything to try and find a safe haven in the US. Crime in South Africa is completely out of control. And I've spoken about this in the past. Since President Ramaphosa and Jacob Zuma closed down the Scorpions as one of Africa and South Africa's most effective law enforcement units, crime has completely spiraled out of control in South Africa. Last year, there were more than 26,000 murders in South Africa. That's about 70 people being murdered every day. There were more than 18,000 kidnappings. That's about 50 people being kidnapped every day, and most of these kidnapped victims not recovered. There were almost 10,000 targeted assassinations. These types of violent crimes affect ordinary South Africans and affect the minority part of the population disproportionately. Since 1994, almost 4,000 farmers have been murdered in their homesteads and attacked alongside their employees on their farms. And so these are all very serious red flags indicating that crime is completely out of control in South Africa. And President Ramaphosa has now had almost 4 terms in office, 2 terms as deputy president and almost 2 terms as president. And he has done nothing about this. And so this is a very serious, a very grievous forsaken of duty on the part of the South African government to protect their own people from organized crime syndicates. And many of these syndicates are cut of the same cloth as the organized crime syndicates that are menacing the American people on the southern border of Mexico. They're tied to the international drug trade. They are really narco-terrorist organizations and structures. And the ANC government under Ramaphosa has done nothing to protect his own people. Instead, he's dedicated very considerable resources to go onto the world stage and to make interventions in other countries, deploying troops in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, bringing charges against Israel in the International Court of Justice, whilst his own people are suffering a near and present danger at home. So I've got tremendous compassion for these families who've arrived in the US. They've suffered great trauma. They've all been through repeated incidents of violent crime. They've all lost loved ones. And so I'm enormously grateful to President Trump and to the US government and the American people for giving them safe haven and an opportunity to make a new start.
So what kind of reception do you think Mr. Ramaphosa will get on Wednesday in Washington in light of what you've just said?
I think the first question here that has come about is whether the folks who've come to America last week qualify as refugees under international law. Now, the definition of a refugee under international law is someone who has a well-founded fear of persecution in his own country and therefore feel that they can't return. The scale and the extent of the crime in South Africa and the scale and the extent of the government's negligence, and complicity in many instances with organized crime syndicates are such that it would be reasonable for anyone to have a fear of persecution to return to the country. And so I think in terms of international law, these families do meet the criteria to qualify as refugees. And until such time as the government take the necessary steps to protect its own citizens, I think more people will take up this opportunity to seek safety for themselves and for their children and for their loved ones.
So you don't agree with criticism in South Africa that they're not really refugees and that a lot of South Africans could qualify for that, not specifically Afrikaners?
Well, I think the executive order and the provisions that the US government have put in place is not specific to Afrikaners. I think anyone who's a member of a minority group qualifies potentially to be considered a refugee. And I think the challenge with the current situation around the Afrikaners is that on the one hand you have these violent criminal organizations that are completely out of control, and that in no way has been combated by the state. There's simply not the political will on the part of the ANC to combat organized crime. On the other hand, you have a very prominent political leader, Julius Malema, who is a member of parliament, who for many years now have publicly espoused the necessity for a genocide against the Afrikaner people by singing the song Kill the Farmer. And Mr. Malema has been given the protection of the law by the ANC government, who have allowed him to continue to do this. So the government have said that no one can prevent him from saying this. This is ordinary and acceptable political speech in South Africa, even though it's completely at odds with the Constitution and completely at odds with the country's laws. And so you have a political leader, one of the largest parties in parliament, being protected by Mr. Ramaphosa's government for espousing what is essentially the intention for a genocide. And of course, his political party, the Economic Freedom Front, Economic Freedom Fighters, has very close ties with organized crime. In fact, it would be fair to say it's the first political party that's been formed in South Africa by an organized crime syndicate. So you have this overlap between organized crime and a very prominent politician who's espousing the need for a genocide under the protection of Ramaphosa's government. And needless to say, that is of great concern for anyone who knows the history of genocides across the world and who's followed the history of genocides in Africa. The genocide in Rwanda started with hate speech that was espoused on radio stations across Rwanda by broadcasters. And the fact that that hate speech was not checked was one of the most important factors behind the genocide taking place in Rwanda, which in 1994 killed more than 1 million people of Tutsi origin. And so I think what President Trump is doing is he's exercising a very important political norm under international law, which is called the responsibility to protect. This is a norm that was formed by the United Nations after the genocide in Rwanda, which places a responsibility on every government to protect its own citizens from the risk of a genocide and from the risk of serious crimes against humanity. And where a government doesn't take up that responsibility, the norm enables the international community to step in and to say, look, there's a serious problem here, and unless you're going to address it, the international community will. And I think that's what the president's executive order has done. Under the responsibility to protect, there are 3 steps that the international community can take. The first one is to give an early warning. I think that's set out very clearly in the executive order. And then secondly, the international community can enter into a dialogue with a responsible government. And I think that's what President Trump is now doing. He's entering into a dialogue with Mr. Ramaphosa about his responsibility to protect his own people from these predations.
So, how do you see the Expropriation Act?
The Expropriation Act enables the government to confiscate anyone's property, not just land, but both movable and immovable property, without compensation. And this is a draconian power that the government is claiming for itself. And it does not bode well for private property. One of the rights that were enshrined under the original constitution that Mandela supported was the importance of private property. And the new Expropriation Act draws a line through it. Now, the fact that no one's property has yet been expropriated under the Act is meaningless, because the Act creates the conditions for the current or a future government to do so. And no one knows who will be in power in South Africa in 4 years' time, and no one knows how this act will be used and exercised by future governments of South Africa and by future leaders of South Africa. And against the backdrop of Malema's advocacy for a genocide and the ANC's indulgence of this advocacy for a genocide, and against the backdrop of the violent expropriation of private property through organized crime, where there's burglaries of more than 1 million South African households last year, or where it's more than 150,000 people being assaulted on the street to steal their property. And such a draconian law must be another red flag in terms of the responsibility to protect.
So, what do you expect the Trump government's going to do? So, they're going to talk to Ramaphosa now, and I don't know if there's been anything that he has done to soften the position of the Trump administration. So, what are you expecting from the Trump administration?
Well, this is not just a trade negotiation or a trade discussion. I think the U.S. government has set out very clearly in the executive order that was passed in January the points which the South African government has to address before they can get to a trade discussion and a trade negotiation. And the first and the most important aspect is addressing this risk of a genocide in South Africa. Now, it's very important to see the events in South Africa in the broader context of African geopolitics. In Washington, during President Bush's first term, Mugabe expropriated the farmers in Zimbabwe, and belatedly at the time, the Congress intervened and passed the Zimbabwe Economic Development and Recovery Act, ZEDERA. And that was a very good act that placed sanctions on Mugabe and his henchmen who did the expropriation of the farms. But by that time, it was too late. The farmers were already expropriated in a violent way, and many of them were killed. Many of their families suffered greatly at this time, and they've lost everything. And many of them arrived in different parts of the world, those who could, penniless and poor, just with their immediate belongings. And commercial agriculture in Zimbabwe collapsed. Food production collapsed. The country that was one of the major food exporters in Africa suddenly had to import food to provide for its own population. And today, after Mugabe has passed, today the ZANU-PF government recognizes that what happened in the past was wrong. And so they are trying to make amends, and they are trying to pay restitution to the farmers whose farms were expropriated without any compensation in a violent manner. And they are trying to raise the issue of how countries in Africa protect their minorities. And so it's very important to see what's happening in South Africa against that background. So we have a situation where there are more than 140 laws that discriminates against minorities in the country. That's on the statute book. And we have a situation where we have a senior politician advocating for a genocide and having the benefit of the protection of the ANC in doing so. And we have a situation where organized crime overlaps with politics and are completely out of control. And those are all red flags and potential building blocks for a repeat scenario of what happened in Zimbabwe and what happened in Rwanda. And so I think the US government, is very far-sighted in exercising its responsibility to protect and providing early warning at this stage of these red flags and engaging the South African government to address these issues and to recognize the fact that these are not the signs of a healthy democracy. A healthy democracy does not see 56,000 of its own citizens being kidnapped, or 26,000 of them being murdered annually, or 8,000 of them killed in targeted assassinations. This is abnormal. These are the signs of a country that's mired in a civil war, not of a healthy democracy.
Well, can we look at South Africa's case against Israel at the International Court of Justice? How much is Trump's actions and the actions of the Trump administrations against South Africa related to that case?
Well, I think it's a reasonable question for the US government to ask Ramaphosa, given that his own house is not in order, why he is persecuting another country through litigation in the International Court of Justice. And I think it's a reasonable question to ask that, given that the ANC protects a politician, Julius Malema, who is advocating for a genocide through hate speech in the country, why they are pursuing another country, another government in another region, accusing them of genocide if their own house is not in order. I think those are reasonable questions to ask. You can't advocate genocide at home and then claim to be exercising the responsibility to prevent genocide abroad. And I think it also applies to the events in the Democratic Republic of the Congo at the moment. So the DRC is one of the largest countries in Africa. It is the treasure chest of Africa. It is in the center of the chessboard because it's the country at the center of Africa, and it's really the beating heart of Africa. Over and above its tremendous mineral wealth, it also has the most important rainforest in Africa, which plays a tremendously important role in the health of our climate. So it's a really important country. And President Ramaphosa deployed thousands of South African troops there instead of harnessing these troops to protect his own people against organized crime, in an intervention that wasn't supported by the East African community, and without any consultation with Rwanda, who is a country that has serious security concerns in the east of the DRC. The DRC already had a major war, a war that was on the scale of the First World War in an African context, in which 17 nations were involved in the late 90s and the early part of the century, and was seriously on the way to having a repeat of that war when the US government intervened and have now brokered a ceasefire with a view to the signing of a treaty in Washington in the coming weeks between the government of the DRC and Rwanda and the other belligerents. Now, this whole war really revolves around the position of minorities in the east of the Congo. And the fact that this is being recognized and that these security concerns are being addressed, I think is very important. And the fact that the US is playing a crucial role to bring peace and stability to the DRC is a major step forward for Africa. And this has really led a number of leaders in Southern Africa to say, look, we've got to address this question of the security of minorities. And this was the subject of great discussion at the last summit of the Southern African Development Community, which represents all the countries in Southern Africa. And I think more and more countries begin to realize that the health of their democracies and the health of their countries are really hallmarked by how they treat their own minorities and the security they give to their own minorities. And to come back again to Mr. Malema, he's not only of concern to President Trump. The British government have banned him from entering the United Kingdom because of his involvement in hate speech, because having a member of parliament advocating a genocide is not normal for a democracy. It is abnormal and under international law unlawful. And it's clearly an issue which needs to be addressed.
Well, a lot of these things that Trump is addressing now seems to be part of the fiber of the ANC, whether it's employment equity, or many of the other stances. Do you expect any step back, any change in policy from the ANC?
I don't think it's part of the fiber of the ANC. It certainly wasn't part of the fiber of the ANC when it was led by Nelson Mandela. Firstly, Nelson Mandela had the courage to fight organized crime. That's why he created the Scorpions. And he asked a 26-year-old Afrikaner kid, me, to help him set up the Scorpions. And in setting up the Scorpions, he didn't discriminate against anyone. He said everyone must help. And he brought detectives who were part of the old apartheid order, who committed to democracy in South Africa, to be part of the Scorpions. He reached out to the US government and asked for the FBI to train the first black graduates that came into the Scorpions. And more than 50 young black graduates did the full FBI training course at Quantico. And Mandela went to great lengths to make sure that the minorities in the country, the Afrikaner community, the other minority communities, including the Jewish community, felt very comfortable with the new democracy. So when Ramaphosa says he's acting in the tradition of Mandela, that's simply not true, because Mandela did have the courage to fight crime. And the current situation requires courage. It requires courageous leadership, and it requires visionary leadership. And unless Mr. Ramaphosa steps up and delivers that, I think he'll be in trouble.
In trouble, like sanctions?
I don't know what further steps the US government might take. Under the responsibility to protect, there are a whole range of interventions that the international community can take to prevent a genocide. Sanctions is one tool. There are tools of economic statecraft. The international community used the responsibility to protect, to do military intervention in Libya, to protect the minority tribes in Libya from Gaddafi. So there are a whole range of measures that the international community can take to exercise the responsibility to protect.
So all in all, it's going to be an uncomfortable meeting with President Trump.
It's hard to predict what will happen in the meeting, but I think the meeting takes place against this background. And unless these very serious issues get addressed, it will be very hard to get to trade talks and trade discussions as if all is well. There was a Afrikaner delegation that visited Washington in the early part of this year after President Trump was inaugurated. When this delegation returned to South Africa, Julius Malema, the man who's espousing genocide against Afrikaners, instituted high treason charges against the members of this delegation. And Ramaphosa's government took up this investigation, and they are investigating these 4 members of civil society who went to Washington to engage with the policy community in Washington for high treason at the moment. In December of last year, there was an attempted terrorist attack on the Samson Religious Community Center in Cape Town, which is one of the oldest Jewish places of worship in the country. It was clearly a terrorist attack. It was on the same day as simultaneous terrorist attacks in Australia and Canada. Those governments immediately called out those incidents as terrorist attacks. To this day, Ramaphosa's government has refused to recognize this as a terrorist attack. And when the chief rabbi of South Africa, Warren Goldstein, said that he was going to investigate what happened in Cape Town out of concern for the safety and security of his community, he was threatened by Ramaphosa's government. We sent very senior state security officials to go and see him. And the minister who's currently accompanying Ramaphosa to Washington, D.C., wrote him a letter threatening him to cease any further investigation into what happened in order to protect his own community. So these are not the actions of a democracy. These are the actions of a government that is complicit in what's happening and who has things to hide.
So to get back to that statement of President Ramaphosa about the families who arrived in the United States, he called them cowards.
The families who arrived in the U.S. are not cowardly. Quite the contrary, they are tremendously courageous. These families have suffered grievous harm and terrible losses in very violent criminal incidents in South Africa. And these families are traumatized. And it took tremendous courage for them to live through those experiences. And it takes tremendous courage now for them to leave everything they know and love, and that's familiar to them and precious to them, behind, and to go and make a new life in America. And making a new life in a new country takes tremendous courage and tremendous bravery and a real pioneering spirit. And this is what these families have shown. And in doing so, although the US offers them great opportunity, and this great republic has shown them great compassion and generosity and kindness to receive them and to give them safe haven, but in doing so, they are leaving behind everything that's familiar to them, and they have to start a new life, and that's really, really hard, and it takes tremendous courage. So there's no cowardice amongst these people, only great courage, because of what they lived through and because of the courageous journey they're now making for the sake of their children and for the safety of their children and their loved ones. The question has arisen whether there's a genocide taking place in South Africa. There's a very clear definition of genocide under Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, and the description of the definition of genocide has 4 important components to it. One, of course, is the killing of members of a group. The second one is causing serious bodily harm or mental harm to members of a group. The third one is deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part. The next one is imposing measures intended to prevent the births within the group or forcibly transferring children from that group. In terms of the second part of this definition, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of a group, clearly given the advocacy of genocide that's being done by Julius Malema, that is causing serious mental harm to people, to Afrikaner people who have to live in South Africa and who have to hear him advocating the genocide on a daily basis under the protection of the ANC government and under the protection of Cyril Ramaphosa. Clearly, anyone who has to wake up in the morning and to hear a member of parliament advocating the massacre of his own people will suffer serious mental harm. And if you combine this with the grievous and violent crime that South Africans have to suffer, and much of that crime being politically inspired, the degree of mental harm further increases. So there are already clear elements of the legal definition of a genocide present in South Africa, and whether that's unfolding or already a reality is difficult for me to assess from the outside. But the definition of a threat is a combination of an intention combined with a capacity to execute that threat plus the opportunity. Now, the intention is clearly there. So Malema has been advocating for a genocide for a very long time. The capacity is there because his political party is very closely linked to these organized crime syndicates who are involved in a whole range of violent crimes. And finally, the question is, will a future opportunity arise? And I think that's where the responsibility to protect comes into play, because this is about preventing something terrible from happening. Because there's a clear intent, there's a clear capacity, there's already very demonstrable harm. And the question is, is it possible to prevent something terrible from happening in South Africa, as this happened in Zimbabwe, as this happened in Rwanda, as it happened in South Sudan? And this is where the responsibility to protect that President Trump is exercising is coming into play. A number of people have claimed that President Trump has been duped by disinformation. The people who allege this or assert this clearly do not know Trump. He is exceedingly well informed. He has an insatiable curiosity and an insatiable appetite for information, much of which he collects himself when he talks to people, both heads of state, business people, ordinary people, people from all walks of life, whether he's at home in the US or traveling abroad. He is an exceptionally well-informed president, and of course he leads, as the commander-in-chief, one of the most formidable intelligence communities in the world that has a great capacity for collecting and analyzing information. So anyone who believes that President Trump has been duped by disinformation completely underestimates the man and underestimates his ability to make up his own mind and to draw his own conclusions. Any visit by any South African delegation, although people may have made representations, will only be one factor amongst many in the government formulating its policy and President formulating his policy and his next steps. When I met President Trump during his first term, he already had a concern about this as an issue. And this was long before Solidarity or any other South African delegation has gone to Washington, D.C. And he had a concern about this because he has been following events closely in South Africa, in part because he plays golf with many South African golfers and therefore has developed a keen interest in the country, but also because generally people talk very freely to him and give him information, and because he follows geopolitics very, very closely.
Andre Pinault, thank you so much.